It was a quiet Friday night, the kind of night that didn't feel dangerous, at least not at first glance. The air was cool, a faint breeze brushing past the dimly lit parking lot. The few scattered cars sat in silence, their windows reflecting the pale orange glow of the overhead streetlights. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, its sound sharp and lonely against the stillness. Emily Walker pulled her black hoodie tighter against the evening chill as she walked across the empty lot. She wasn't in a hurry, her steps even and steady. She was a woman in her mid-30s, with an average build and an unremarkable appearance. She wasn't flashy, and she didn't draw attention. Her jeans were plain, her sneakers slightly scuffed, and her face free of makeup. To anyone watching, Emily looked like a nobody, a quiet, harmless woman going about her evening business. She blended into the background, just another shadow in the night. But there was something in the way she moved. Her steps, though unhurried, had purpose. Her eyes scanned the surroundings briefly as she neared the ATM, and the way she glanced over her shoulder showed she was more aware of her surroundings than she let on. She reached the machine, pulled out her card, and slid it into the slot. The screen lit up, asking her to enter her PIN. Her fingers moved deliberately, her focus on the task at hand. Yet, behind her calm demeanor, she was quietly taking in every sound, every flicker of movement. A gust of wind swept through the parking lot, rustling a discarded candy wrapper near her feet. Emily's eyes darted to the side briefly, then back to the screen. Her senses were sharp, her instincts alive. She didn't know why, but something felt off. She wasn't scared, though. Fear wasn't an emotion Emily entertained easily. And then, like a predator revealing itself, the quiet night was shattered. 3 motorcycles roared into the parking lot, their engines growling like wild beasts. The sound echoed off the empty walls of the nearby convenience store. Emily didn't turn around, but she knew they were there. She'd heard them before she saw them. The bikes screeched to a halt near the curb, the tires kicking up a small spray of gravel. The men dismounted, one after the other, their movements deliberate and cocky. They were dressed in dark leather jackets, heavy boots, and ripped jeans, the kind of uniform meant to intimidate. Chains hung from their belts, glinting in the faint light. One of them laughed, the sound low and cruel, breaking the silence like shattered glass. His voice carried across the lot. "Looks like we found ourselves some company, boys." Emily didn't flinch. She continued with her transaction, her fingers moving across the keypad as if she hadn't heard them. But she had. Every word, every step they took, every rustle of their jackets, it was all registering in her mind. The tallest of the trio stepped forward, his boots thudding heavily against the pavement. He was broad-shouldered and thick-set, with a scar running down the side of his face. His presence radiated arrogance, the kind of false confidence that came from bullying those who couldn't fight back. "It's just one lady," he muttered to the others, his lips curling into a smirk. "This'll be easy." The second man chuckled, leaning against his bike. He was wiry and quick, with darting eyes that seemed to size up everything at once. "She doesn't even know we're here yet," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. The third man, smaller but no less menacing, stayed silent. He pulled a cigarette from his pocket, lit it with a flick of his lighter, and took a slow drag. The orange ember glowed briefly in the darkness before fading into the shadows. Emily could feel their eyes on her, their gazes heavy and predatory. She knew exactly what they saw: a lone woman at an ATM, late at night, with no one around to help her. To them, she was an easy target. Vulnerable. Helpless. But they were wrong. Emily's hand hovered over the ATM keypad for a moment, her posture relaxed but her mind working fast. She took a slow, steady breath. She'd dealt with men like this before. She knew their type: the bravado, the overconfidence, the hunger for power over those they thought were weaker. They always underestimated their victims. The tallest biker took another step forward, closing the gap between them. His boots crunched against the gravel, loud and deliberate. He wanted her to hear him. He wanted her to be scared. "Hey, sweetheart," he called out, his voice rough and mocking. "Why don't you hand over that cash and save us all some trouble?" Emily turned her head slightly, just enough to glance at him from the corner of her eye. Her face was calm, almost unreadable. "I don't think so," she said simply. The words hung in the air, cool and steady. The tall man froze for a second, caught off guard by her lack of fear. Then he laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Oh, we got ourselves a tough one, huh?" he said, glancing back at his friends. "Think she's gonna put up a fight?" The others laughed too, the sound echoing in the empty lot. Emily turned back to the ATM, her fingers pressing the final buttons to complete her transaction. The machine beeped, and the cash slot opened with a soft mechanical whir. She took the money and slipped it into her pocket without hurry. The tall man took another step forward, now only a few feet away. "Lady, you're making a big mistake," he said, his tone darker now. "This ain't a game." Emily finally turned to face him fully, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, neither of them moved. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like a standoff. The big, burly man against the small, quiet woman. But there was something in Emily's gaze, something sharp and unshakable, that made the tall man hesitate. "Walk away," she said softly, her voice firm but not loud. The tall man blinked, confused for a moment. Then he scowled, shaking off the strange feeling her words had given him. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said, stepping closer. "But guts won't save you tonight." He reached for her arm, his thick fingers closing around her wrist. Emily didn't pull away. She didn't scream or panic. Instead, she looked up at him, her expression steady, her eyes unwavering. "You don't want to do this," she said, her voice calm and measured. The tall man's grip tightened, his face twisting into a sneer. "And why's that?" he growled. Emily tilted her head slightly, her lips curling into the faintest hint of a smile. "Because," she said, her tone almost amused. "You have no idea who you're messing with." And in that moment, the flicker of awareness that had been in her eyes all along grew brighter. A shift in the air. A silent warning. The bikers didn't realize it yet, but their easy target was about to become their biggest mistake. The tall man's sneer widened, but there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes barely noticeable, but Emily caught it. Her calmness wasn't something he'd expected. Most people would have been trembling by now, trying to reason, pleading for mercy. But Emily wasn't most people. Behind him, the wiry man leaned forward, his grin showing yellowed teeth. He tapped his chain against his palm, creating a rhythmic clinking sound. "What's with the attitude, lady? You're outnumbered. 3 of us, 1 of you. And you're telling us to walk away." He let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. "You've got some nerve. I'll give you that." The third biker, the quiet one still puffing on his cigarette, exhaled a stream of smoke into the night air. He didn't say much, but his eyes flicked between Emily and the tall man. "Hurry it up, Jack," he muttered, his voice low and gruff. "Get her cash, and let's go. I don't like hanging around here too long." Jack, the tall man, tightened his grip on Emily's wrist, ignoring the warning. His pride was on the line now. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a growl. "Listen, lady, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but this isn't the time for jokes. Hand over the cash. Now." Emily didn't flinch. Her pulse was steady. Her breathing controlled. She'd been in worse situations than this, situations where the stakes were life or death, where split-second decisions determined who walked away and who didn't. And in every single one of those moments, she had prevailed. "You've already made one mistake tonight," Emily said evenly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Don't make another one." Her words weren't loud, but they carried weight. Jack frowned, his confidence wavering for a split second. Then his ego flared up, drowning out any instinct to back down. He laughed a short, bitter sound and released her wrist, shoving her backward. Emily stumbled slightly, catching herself with ease. She stood her ground, her expression unchanged. "All right," Jack said, cracking his knuckles. "You want to do this the hard way? Fine by me." He stepped toward her, his hand reaching for the chain hanging from his belt. Behind him, the wiry man and the smoker exchanged glances, their laughter dying down as the tension thickened. Emily's eyes flicked toward the chain. Her muscles tensed, her instincts sharp. She didn't make a move yet, waiting, calculating. Timing was everything. Jack raised the chain, letting it dangle menacingly in front of her. "Last chance, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Be smart. Give me the money." Emily tilted her head slightly, her gaze locking onto his. She let the silence hang in the air for a moment before she spoke. "No." It was a simple word, but it carried enough force to make Jack's grin falter. The wiry man let out a low whistle. "She's got guts, I'll give her that," he muttered, his tone laced with amusement. "Too bad guts won't help her now." Jack's face twisted into a scowl. He was done talking. With a flick of his wrist, he swung the chain toward Emily, the metal flashing in the faint light. But Emily was faster. She sidestepped smoothly, the chain missing her by inches. Before Jack could recover, she grabbed his arm, twisting it sharply. The chain clattered to the ground as Jack let out a startled grunt of pain. The wiry man's eyes widened. "What the?" Emily didn't give Jack a chance to react. With a swift movement, she stepped behind him, locking his arm in a tight hold. Her grip was firm, unrelenting, and it was clear she knew exactly what she was doing. "Stop," she said, her voice calm but commanding. "This doesn't have to go any further." For a moment, the parking lot fell silent. Even the smoker seemed frozen, his cigarette hanging from his lips as he watched the scene unfold. Jack struggled against her hold, his face red with frustration. "Let me go, you." Emily applied more pressure, cutting him off mid-sentence. "I said stop," she repeated, her tone leaving no room for argument. The wiry man took a step forward, his chain clinking in his hand. "Let him go," he barked, his voice rising. "Or you're gonna regret it." Emily's eyes flicked toward him briefly, assessing. "If you take one more step, I'll break his arm," she said matter-of-factly. Her words weren't a threat. They were a promise. The wiry man hesitated, his confidence faltering. He looked at Jack, who was grimacing in pain, and then back at Emily. For the first time, doubt crept into his expression. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice shaky now. Emily didn't answer. She didn't need to. Behind her, Jack let out a frustrated growl. "Get her off me," he shouted, his voice cracking under the strain. The smoker finally spoke up, his tone sharp. "Enough," he said, tossing his cigarette to the ground and crushing it under his boot. "Let's just grab the money and go. This ain't worth it." But it was too late for that. Emily released Jack abruptly, shoving him forward. He stumbled but managed to catch himself, spinning around to face her with rage in his eyes. "You're dead," he snarled, reaching for a knife tucked into his boot. Emily's posture shifted subtly, her stance widening, her hands ready. She wasn't afraid. The wiry man and the smoker exchanged uneasy glances. Things were escalating, and neither of them seemed eager to follow Jack's lead anymore. "Jack, man, maybe we should," the wiry man started, but Jack cut him off with a glare. "No," Jack snapped, pulling the knife from his boot. "She's gonna pay for this." Emily's eyes flicked to the knife. It was small, sharp, and deadly in the hands of someone reckless. But she didn't move, not yet. Jack lunged at her, the blade aimed for her midsection. Emily reacted instantly. She sidestepped again, her movements smooth and precise. She grabbed his wrist, twisting it sharply and forcing him to drop the knife. The weapon clattered to the ground, sliding out of reach. Before Jack could recover, Emily delivered a swift elbow strike to his chest, knocking the wind out of him. He staggered backward, gasping for air. The wiry man dropped his chain and held up his hands, palms out. Okay, we get it," he said quickly, his voice tinged with panic. We're done. The smoker stayed where he was, his expression unreadable. He didn't make a move to help Jack, nor did he try to intervene. Jack straightened up, his face contorted with anger and humiliation. "You're gonna regret this," he spat, his voice hoarse. "You don't know who you're messing with." Emily took a step forward, her eyes locked on his. "No," she said calmly. "You don't know who you're messing with." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The wiry man grabbed Jack's arm, pulling him back. "Come on, man. Let's just go. She's not worth it." For a moment, Jack looked like he was going to argue. But then his gaze shifted to Emily, her steady stance, her calm expression, the quiet confidence in her eyes. And something in him faltered. "Fine," he muttered, yanking his arm away from the wiry man. "Let's get out of here." The three men retreated to their bikes, their swagger noticeably diminished. Jack climbed onto his motorcycle, casting one last glare at Emily before revving the engine. "This ain't over," he said, his voice low and venomous. Emily didn't respond. She simply watched as they sped out of the parking lot, the roar of their engines fading into the distance. When the silence returned, Emily bent down and picked up her money from where it had fallen. She slipped it into her pocket and turned back to the ATM, retrieving her card. Her heart was steady, her breathing calm. She straightened her hoodie, adjusted her stance, and walked back to her car as if nothing had happened. For Emily Walker, this was just another ordinary night. Emily quietly inserted her card into the ATM, her fingers moving with deliberate calmness. The machine beeped as it processed her request, its quiet hum the only sound breaking the tense silence in the lot. Behind her, the bikers were closing in, their boots scraping against the asphalt, the metallic jingle of chains ringing out with each movement. They weren't in a rush, they thought they had all the time in the world. "Don't make this hard, sweetheart," one of them barked, his voice rough and gravelly. He sounded like a man who was used to getting his way. "Just hand over your purse, maybe toss in your PIN number, and we'll let you walk away. Easy, right?" Emily didn't turn around. She could feel their presence growing closer, the oppressive weight of their shadows stretching over her small frame. They towered behind her like predators toying with their catch, their overconfidence palpable. The tallest one, Jack, was already smirking, his hand resting on the chain hanging from his belt. He nudged the wiry man beside him, who let out a low, wheezy chuckle. "Looks like we caught ourselves a quiet one," the wiry man said, his grin stretching too wide. "Ain't even screaming yet. Makes it boring when they don't fight back, don't it?" "Don't worry," Jack replied with mock cheer. "They always cry in the end." The third biker, still puffing on his cigarette, said nothing. He was quieter than the others, but Emily could sense his calculating gaze studying her, trying to measure her fear. It was a familiar feeling, that predatory stare. She had encountered it many times before, in far worse places than a dimly lit parking lot. Emily finished her transaction, the ATM spitting out the cash she had requested. Slowly, she folded the bills and slipped them into her pocket. Then, for the first time, she spoke. "You don't want to do this." Her voice was calm. Too calm. It wasn't the shaky, pleading tone they were used to hearing from people in her situation. There was no quiver of fear, no desperate attempt to appeal to their humanity. Instead, her words were steady, measured, and carried with them a weight that didn't fit the image of a lone woman standing at an ATM. Jack froze for half a second, caught off guard by her tone. He quickly shook it off and stepped closer, grabbing her by the arm. His grip was rough, his calloused fingers digging into her sleeve. "Oh, I think we do," he said, leaning down until his face was only inches from hers. His breath reeked of stale cigarettes and cheap beer. Emily didn't resist. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she turned her head slightly and looked up at him, her eyes locking onto his. They weren't wide with panic, as he'd expected. Instead, they were steady, calm, and unervingly focused. There was no fear in them, only something that made him feel like he was the one being cornered. "What's that look for?" Jack growled, his smirk faltering ever so slightly. He tightened his grip on her arm, as if to reassert his dominance. "Think you're tough or something?" Emily's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile. Not a friendly smile, but one that was cold, calculated. A smile that said she knew something he didn't. "You have no idea," she replied softly. Jack's confusion turned to irritation. He didn't like the way she was looking at him, like she was sizing him up, like she wasn't taking him seriously. He was used to people cowering, begging, pleading. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The wiry man stepped forward, swinging his chain lazily in one hand. "You hearing this, Jack? She thinks she's clever. Bet she's just stalling, hoping someone'll come save her. Hate to break it to you, lady, but there's no one coming." Jack grinned at that, his confidence returning. "Yeah," he said, yanking on her arm to pull her closer. "No one's gonna help you. Just us out here. So why don't you stop with the attitude and make this easy on yourself?" Emily didn't respond. She tilted her head slightly, as if considering something. Her eyes flicked to the chain in the wiry man's hand, then back to Jack. It was a subtle movement, but it was enough to make Jack hesitate again. "What are you looking at?" he snapped, his voice rising slightly. There was an edge of uncertainty creeping into his tone now, though he tried to mask it with aggression. Emily finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her free hand and placed it on Jack's wrist, the one gripping her arm. It wasn't a desperate attempt to pull away, nor was it a gesture of submission. It was controlled, purposeful. "You should let go," she said quietly. Her voice was calm, almost conversational, but there was steel underneath it. "Before this gets worse." The smoker, who had been silent until now, let out a low chuckle. "She's got some nerve, I'll give her that," he said, exhaling a plume of smoke. "But Jack doesn't let go, do you, Jack?" Jack grinned, regaining his bravado. "No, I don't." He tightened his grip even more, his knuckles whitening. "All right, lady, enough games. You're gonna hand over your purse, your cash, and anything else you've got. Or we're gonna make you wish you had." The wiry man swung his chain against the asphalt, the metallic clang echoing through the lot. "Better listen to him," he said, his grin widening. "Things can get real ugly, real fast." Emily didn't react to their threats. She simply stood there, her expression unchanged. Jack could feel the tension in her arm, the quiet strength lying just beneath the surface. It was unsettling, like holding a coiled spring that could snap at any moment. "What's your problem?" Jack barked, his frustration boiling over. "You think you're tough? You think we're scared of you? Emily's smile widened, just a fraction. No, she said. But you should be. The moment hung in the air, heavy and charged. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed Jack's face. He didn't like this. He didn't like her calmness, her confidence. It didn't make sense. She was supposed to be scared, trembling, begging for mercy. Instead, she was looking at him like she was in control. The wiry man noticed the change in Jack's demeanor and stepped forward, his chain swinging more aggressively now. What's the hold-up, Jack? Just take her stuff already. Jack glared at him, then back at Emily. He was angry now, not just at her but at himself for hesitating. He didn't want to admit it, but there was something about her that unsettled him. Still, he couldn't back down. Not in front of the others. Fine, he growled, releasing her arm abruptly. You wanna play tough? Let's see how tough you really are. He reached for the chain on his belt, pulling it free with a sharp yank. The wiry man stepped back, grinning eagerly, while the smoker stayed where he was, watching with a faint smirk. Emily remained still, her eyes following Jack's movements. Her muscles tensed slightly, her stance shifting ever so subtly. She was ready. Jack swung the chain, the metal glinting in the dim light as it sliced through the air. It was a wild, aggressive move, meant to intimidate. But Emily didn't flinch. She stepped to the side with practiced ease, the chain missing her by inches. Before Jack could recover, Emily moved. Her hand shot out, grabbing the chain and yanking it out of his grasp with a force that caught him off guard. The metal clattered to the ground between them. Jack stumbled back, his eyes wide with surprise. The wiry man's grin faltered, and even the smoker straightened slightly, his smirk fading. What the Jack began, but Emily didn't give him a chance to finish. You should have walked away, she said calmly, stepping forward. Jack's confidence shattered as he realized too late that he had underestimated her. But Emily wasn't done. Not yet. Jack stumbled backward, his face twisting in confusion and anger. Emily stepped toward him, her movements deliberate, controlled. She didn't rush, she didn't need to. The moment was hers now, and everyone in that parking lot could feel the sudden shift in power. You've made a mistake, Emily said, her voice calm but carrying an edge that sliced through the silence. She stood there, the chain dangling loosely in her hand, the dim glow of the street light catching the metal links as they swayed. Jack growled, trying to shake off the embarrassment. What are you waiting for? He barked at his crew. Get her. The wiry man hesitated, his chain still swinging lazily in his hand. His earlier bravado wavered as he watched Emily. Something about her wasn't right, she wasn't acting the way their usual targets did. No fear, no desperation. Just, control. Go. Jack shouted again, his voice cracking with irritation. He wasn't used to being defied, especially not by someone like her. The wiry man muttered something under his breath but stepped forward. He raised his chain, the sharp metallic links glinting in the light, and swung it in a wide arc toward Emily. It wasn't precise, it was more about intimidation than accuracy, but Emily didn't flinch. She sidestepped with ease, her movements fluid, as if she had done this 100 times before. Before the wiry man could recover, Emily stepped inside his reach. Her foot shot out, striking him in the knee with precision. He let out a yelp as his leg buckled, and before he could react further, she brought her elbow down hard on his wrist. The chain slipped from his grasp and clattered to the ground. The wiry man staggered back, clutching his wrist and glaring at her. What the hell? But Emily wasn't done. She stepped forward again, closing the distance between them. Her hand shot out, grabbing the front of his jacket. With surprising strength, she yanked him forward, twisting her body as she sent him sprawling to the ground. He hit the asphalt with a grunt, his chain lying uselessly a few feet away. Jack and the smoker froze, their earlier confidence evaporating. The wiry man groaned, rolling onto his side, but he didn't try to get up. He looked at Emily with wide eyes, his earlier arrogance replaced by something closer to fear. "Who the hell are you?" Jack demanded, his voice shaking slightly. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a knife. The blade gleamed as he flicked it open, the sound sharp and deliberate. Emily turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Does it matter?" she asked. Her voice was steady, unshaken. "I warned you." Jack hesitated. For the first time, he was questioning everything about this situation. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was supposed to be scared, supposed to give in. Instead, she was standing there, calm and composed, as if she had done this before. The smoker finally moved, tossing his cigarette to the ground and stepping forward. He didn't say anything, he just reached into his jacket and pulled out a crowbar. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he was testing her reaction. Emily glanced at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "2 on 1, she asked, her tone almost mocking. "Fair fight, is it?" Jack sneered, regaining some of his confidence. "You're gonna wish it was 3 on 1 when we're done with you." The smoker smirked, gripping the crowbar tightly. He moved in tandem with Jack, circling her slowly, their eyes locked on her every movement. They were cautious now, no longer underestimating her, but their overconfidence hadn't entirely disappeared. Emily stood her ground, her stance relaxed but ready. She watched them carefully, her eyes flicking between Jack's knife and the smoker's crowbar. They were predictable, sloppy, uncoordinated. She could see it in the way they moved, the way they hesitated just a fraction too long. Jack lunged first, his knife flashing toward her in a wide arc. Emily pivoted, her movements precise and efficient. She grabbed his wrist mid-swing, twisting it sharply. Jack let out a yell as the knife clattered to the ground. Emily followed up with a swift kick to his stomach, sending him staggering backward. The smoker took his chance, swinging the crowbar at her with all his strength. Emily ducked, the metal bar whistling past her head. She stepped forward, her hand shooting out to grab his wrist. With a quick twist, she forced him to drop the crowbar, which hit the ground with a dull thud. Before he could react, Emily spun, bringing her elbow up to strike him across the jaw. The smoker stumbled, dazed, but she didn't let up. She swept his legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the asphalt. Jack, still clutching his stomach, glared at her with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "You think you're so tough," he spat, backing away slightly. "You don't know who you're messing with." Emily tilted her head, her expression calm. "Neither do you." The wiry man, who had been watching from the ground, scrambled to his feet. His earlier fear was now mixed with anger, but he didn't move toward her. Instead, he glanced at Jack and the smoker, both of whom were struggling to recover. "This isn't worth it," he muttered, his voice shaking. "Let's just go." Jack glared at him. "What? You're just gonna run?" The wiry man hesitated, glancing at Emily again. "Look at her, man. She's not normal. This ain't worth it." Jack growled, his pride wounded, but even he couldn't ignore the reality of the situation. Emily stood there, unharmed, her breathing steady, while the three of them were battered and beaten. "You're lucky," Jack spat, pointing a finger at her. "You don't know how lucky you are." Emily didn't respond. She simply stood there, watching as he backed away, his crew following reluctantly. The wiry man limped slightly, while the smoker rubbed his jaw, his earlier smirk completely gone. As they mounted their bikes, Jack shot her one last glare. "This ain't over," he said, revving his engine. Emily raised an eyebrow, her expression unimpressed. "Yes, it is." Jack hesitated, then snarled and sped off, his tires screeching against the asphalt. The others followed, their engines roaring as they disappeared into the night. The parking lot fell silent again, the only sound the faint hum of the ATM. Emily stood there for a moment, her shoulders relaxing as she let out a slow breath. She glanced at the chain still clutched in her hand, then dropped it to the ground. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her calm, steady stride the same as it had been when she first arrived. The night swallowed her figure as she disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind only the faint echo of her footsteps. The sight of the badge stopped the tallest biker in his tracks. His knife hovered mid-air, his mouth slightly open as he tried to process what he was seeing. The other two men, still clutching their sides and trying to recover, exchanged uneasy glances. Emily's voice cut through the tense silence. "You were saying?" She tilted her head slightly, her expression calm, almost disinterested, as if she hadn't just taken down three grown men with ease. The tallest biker's grip on the knife tightened, but the confidence he had earlier was gone. "That doesn't mean anything," he muttered, his voice shaky. "You're just some rent-a-cop or something." Emily's lips curved into a faint smile, but her eyes stayed cold. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, folded ID. Flicking it open with practiced ease, she held it up for them to see. The words "Federal Agent" and her name, Emily Walker, were clearly visible, along with an official emblem. The wiry biker, still nursing his injured wrist, let out a low curse. "You've got to be kidding me." The third man, the one who had tried to swing the crowbar, shook his head, his face pale. "This is bad, Jack. This is really bad." Jack, the tallest one, tried to recover some semblance of authority. "So what? You think flashing a badge is gonna scare me? We're not afraid of some federal agent." Emily raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. "You should be," she said simply. Jack laughed, but it sounded forced. "Oh yeah? Why's that?" Emily took a step closer, her movements so deliberate and measured that the bikers instinctively took a step back. She glanced at the knife still in Jack's hand. "Because I'm not just some federal agent," she said, her voice calm but laced with steel. "And because you're out of your depth." Jack hesitated, his bravado faltering again. "You're bluffing." Emily didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached into her hoodie pocket and pulled out something small and black. She held it up, pressing a button, and a tiny red light began to blink. "Bluffing," she said, her voice steady. "I just sent a distress signal to my team. They'll be here in 5 minutes." Her gaze flicked to the motorcycles parked nearby. Maybe less, considering the FBI doesn't take kindly to armed thugs attacking one of their own. The wiry biker let out another string of curses. "Jack, we need to get out of here." "Shut up." Jack snapped, but his voice cracked under the pressure. His eyes darted between Emily and his two companions. The knife in his hand wavered. "You're lying. There's no way you're FBI." Emily tilted her head slightly, her expression calm and unbothered. "Do you really want to test that theory?" she asked, her tone cool. She stepped closer, her presence commanding. "Because I promise you, you'll regret it." Jack's hand twitched, but he didn't move. His breathing had grown uneven, and sweat was starting to bead on his forehead. The wiry man was already backing away, his earlier bravado completely gone. "I'm not sticking around for this," he muttered, limping toward his motorcycle. The third biker followed without a word, his crowbar forgotten on the ground. He threw one last nervous glance at Emily before climbing onto his bike. "Cowards," Jack growled, but his voice lacked conviction. He turned back to Emily, his anger replaced by frustration and a hint of fear. "This isn't over," he said, his tone weak. Emily didn't flinch. "Yes, it is," she replied firmly. Her voice carried a quiet authority that left no room for argument. Jack hesitated for a moment longer, then let out a frustrated yell and threw his knife to the ground. He stomped over to his bike, muttering curses under his breath. The roar of the engines broke the silence as the three bikers sped away into the night, their confidence shattered. For a moment, the parking lot was quiet again, save for the hum of the ATM machine. Emily stood there, watching the bikers disappear into the distance. She waited until the sound of their engines faded completely before exhaling a soft sigh. She reached down, picked up the discarded knife, and tossed it into a nearby trash can. Then she adjusted her hoodie and turned back to the ATM, her movements calm and unhurried. As she finished her transaction, the soft beep of the machine broke the silence. Emily glanced around the parking lot one last time, ensuring that the threat was truly gone. Satisfied, she slipped her card back into her wallet and walked toward her car. But as she reached for the door handle, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her brow furrowing slightly as she read the text on the screen. Target identified. Surveillance needed ASAP. Details to follow. Emily's calm demeanor didn't waver, but her mind was already shifting gears. The bikers had been an annoyance and unexpected interruption to her night. But this message? This was something else entirely. She slid into the driver's seat, her movements smooth and efficient. As she started the car, the faint glow of her dashboard illuminated her face. Her eyes were sharp, focused, and alert. This wasn't over, not for her, and not for whatever was coming next. Emily drove through the quiet streets, her mind racing despite her composed demeanor. The glow of streetlights passed over her windshield like flickering signals, her thoughts mirroring the rhythm. She had anticipated a quiet evening after finishing her report earlier that day. But things rarely went as planned in her line of work. The text message still lingered on her mind. Target identified. Surveillance needed ASAP. Those few words were enough to shift her entire focus. There was a bigger game afoot, one that dwarfed the skirmish with the bikers. And if she was being called in, it meant the stakes were high, possibly life-threatening. Emily navigated the back roads toward her safe house, a modest two-story townhouse on the edge of the city. She had chosen the location for its anonymity, an ordinary home in an ordinary neighborhood, perfect for blending in. As she pulled into the driveway, she quickly scanned her surroundings, her eyes flicking to the parked cars and darkened houses. Old habits die hard, especially when you're trained to trust nothing at face value. Inside, the safe house was clean, minimal, and meticulously organized. Emily's phone buzzed again as she locked the door behind her. This time, it wasn't a text. It was a secured video call. She glanced at the caller ID. Command. Walker, she answered, her voice steady as the image of her handler appeared on the screen. Agent Harris, a man in his 50s with a grizzled beard and piercing blue eyes, didn't waste time on pleasantries. Situations escalated, he said bluntly. The bikers you encountered tonight? They're part of a larger crew, the Iron Fangs. Emily frowned slightly, though her expression remained calm. The Iron Fangs. I thought they were small-time petty theft, intimidation, maybe some light smuggling. Not anymore, Harris replied, his tone grim. Intel suggests they've been expanding. New leadership, new tactics. And we have reason to believe they're connected to a major arms deal going down in the city. Tonight's incident might not have been random. Emily's eyes narrowed. You're saying they might have been scouting me? It's possible, Harris admitted. Or they might have just seen an opportunity and took it. Either way, their leader Marcus Kane is dangerous. We've been trying to pin him down for months, but he's a ghost. We need eyes on him, and fast. Emily leaned against the counter, processing the information. The Iron Fangs weren't just a gang of overconfident bikers, they were part of a larger puzzle, one that could have national security implications. And Marcus Kane? She had heard whispers of his name before. A ruthless, methodical operator who was as smart as he was brutal. "What's the plan?" she asked, her voice steady. Harris's image flickered slightly as he adjusted the camera on his end. "You'll infiltrate their local hangout, an abandoned warehouse on the south side of town. We've already arranged for you to get in close. You'll pose as a buyer looking to procure special goods. That should get you an audience with Kane. And when I meet him, you do what you do best: observe, gather intel, and report back. But be careful, Walker. Kane doesn't trust outsiders, and he's got a knack for sniffing out undercover agents. One wrong move, and you won't get a second chance." Emily nodded, her mind already shifting into mission mode. "Understood." Harris's expression softened slightly. "And Walker, good job tonight. Those bikers didn't know who they were messing with." A faint smile tugged at the corner of Emily's lips. "They do now." The call ended, leaving Emily alone in the quiet of the safe house. She placed her phone on the counter and began preparing. First, she changed out of her black hoodie and jeans, swapping them for a fitted leather jacket and dark boots, an outfit that would help her blend in with the Iron Fangs crowd. Next, she checked her gear: a small, concealed earpiece for communication, a lockpick set tucked into her boot, and a compact handgun holstered at her side. As she worked, her thoughts returned to the bikers from earlier. Were they really connected to Kane's operation? Or had she just been in the wrong place at the wrong time? Either way, she couldn't afford to dwell on it. This mission required her full focus. By the time Emily arrived at the warehouse, it was nearing midnight. The area was desolate, the kind of place where no one asked questions and even fewer people offered answers. The warehouse loomed ahead, its broken windows and graffiti-covered walls a stark reminder of the city's underbelly. The low rumble of engines echoed in the distance as more bikers arrived, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Emily parked her car a block away and approached on foot, her movements careful and deliberate. As she neared the warehouse, she spotted a makeshift checkpoint: two burly men standing guard, both armed and wearing Iron Fangs patches on their jackets. One of them, a bearded man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward as she approached. "Who the hell are you?" he barked, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. Emily didn't flinch. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a thick envelope, holding it up for him to see. "I'm here to do business," she said calmly. "Your boss is expecting me." The scarred man eyed her suspiciously, but the sight of the envelope seemed to ease his tension. He motioned for her to follow him inside, though his posture remained guarded. The interior of the warehouse was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of oil and cigarette smoke. Rows of motorcycles lined the walls, along with crates marked with cryptic symbols. Groups of bikers lounged around, some playing cards, others drinking and laughing loudly. Emily scanned the room quickly, her trained eyes taking in every detail. This wasn't just a gang, it was an operation. The crates likely held weapons, and the bikers weren't just thugs, they were foot soldiers in a larger network. Scarface led her to a corner of the warehouse where a makeshift office had been set up. Behind a battered desk sat a man in his early 40s with sharp features and cold, calculating eyes. His leather jacket was adorned with patches, but it was the one on his chest and Iron Wolf's head that marked him as Marcus Kane. "Who's this?" Kane asked, his voice low and dangerous. "She says she's here for business," Scarface replied, handing over the envelope. Kane opened it, his eyes scanning the contents: a stack of cash and a note with a single word: "interested." He looked up at Emily, his gaze piercing. "You've got my attention. Now tell me, what exactly are you looking to buy?" Emily met his stare without hesitation. "Something powerful," she said. "Something that can't be traced." Kane leaned back in his chair, studying her intently. "You don't look like the usual buyer. Who are you really? Emily smiled faintly, her confidence unwavering. Let's just say I'm someone who knows how to get things done. And I hear you're the man to talk to. For a moment, Kane said nothing. Then, he nodded slowly, a sly grin spreading across his face. All right, then. Let's talk. As Emily sat down across from him, she knew this was only the beginning. The real danger hadn't even started yet. Emily stood in the eerie silence of the parking lot, the faint hum of the distant streetlights the only sound now. She let out a slow breath, her composure unshaken as she watched the bikers flee like rats abandoning a sinking ship. Their arrogance had vanished, replaced by the bitter sting of fear. She bent down to pick up the knife the leader had dropped, turning it over in her hand. It was nothing special, cheap steel, dull blade, all bark and no bite. A lot like the men who had wielded it. She tossed it aside with a faint smirk and adjusted her hoodie. The adrenaline coursing through her veins began to settle, but Emily knew tonight wasn't over. Not yet. As she turned to leave, the sound of a vehicle approaching made her pause. A black SUV rolled into the parking lot, its tinted windows reflecting the orange glow of the streetlights. Emily's muscles tensed as she instinctively reached for her concealed weapon. The SUV came to a slow stop, and the door creaked open. A man stepped out, his frame imposing and his movements deliberate. He was dressed in a tailored black coat, his silver hair slicked back, and his piercing gray eyes locked on Emily. "Ms. Walker," he said smoothly, his voice like ice. Emily's grip on her gun tightened. "And you are?" The man offered a small, calculating smile. "Someone who's been watching you for quite some time." Her heart rate quickened, though her face betrayed nothing. She didn't recognize him, but his presence was no accident. This wasn't a random encounter. "Mind telling me why you're following me?" she asked, her tone steady. The man took a step closer, his hands in his coat pockets. "You're very good at what you do, Emily. Too good. Tonight, you dismantled 3 of my men in under 30 seconds. Impressive, but inconvenient." The pieces clicked into place in her mind. He wasn't just some passerby, he was connected to the bikers. Perhaps even their boss. "Marcus Kane," she said, the name tasting bitter on her tongue. Kane tilted his head slightly, as if impressed. "So, you've heard of me?" Emily's jaw tightened. "Hard not to when your name's tied to every dirty deal in the city." Kane chuckled, the sound devoid of warmth. "Flattering. But you see, Ms. Walker, tonight was supposed to send a message. Those men weren't just random thugs, they were part of something bigger. And you've just become a problem I can't ignore." Emily's posture shifted, her instincts screaming that trouble was seconds away. She had faced men like Kane before, charismatic, ruthless, and dangerous. They were always the most unpredictable. "So, what now?" she asked, keeping her voice calm. "You going to try and scare me off? Send more of your men after me?" Kane's smile widened, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, no. Scaring you off would be a waste of your talents. I'd much rather recruit you." Emily blinked, caught off guard for a split second. "Recruit me?" "Yes," Kane said, taking another step closer. "You're clearly not just some civilian. You're trained, disciplined, and resourceful. Qualities I value. Qualities I could use." She scoffed, shaking her head. "I don't work for criminals." Kane's smile faltered, his tone darkening. "That's unfortunate. Because if you're not with me, then you're against me. And I don't take kindly to opposition." Before Emily could respond, the back door of the SUV opened, and 2 more men stepped out, both tall, heavily armed, and clearly not amateurs. They flanked Kane like loyal guard dogs, their eyes cold and unyielding. Emily's mind raced. The odds weren't in her favor, but she'd faced worse. Kane might have had the upper hand now, but he didn't know who he was dealing with. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice low and firm. Kane chuckled again, the sound grating against her nerves. "The only mistake here is yours, Ms. Walker. You had the chance to walk away. Now, I'm afraid things will get messy." One of the men raised his weapon, but before he could aim, Emily moved. In a blur of motion, she drew her gun and fired a precise shot, hitting the man's hand and causing him to drop his weapon with a pained yell. She pivoted, ducking low as the second man lunged at her. Using his momentum against him, she drove her elbow into his gut, then swept his legs out from under him. Kane stepped back, his composed demeanor cracking as Emily closed the distance between them. She grabbed him by the collar, slamming him against the side of the SUV. "You think you're untouchable," she hissed, her face inches from his. "You're nothing but a parasite, feeding off fear and chaos. And parasites get exterminated." Kane's eyes narrowed, his bravado wavering for the first time. "You're making enemies you can't afford, Walker." She tightened her grip, her voice like steel. "The only thing I can't afford is letting scum like you run free." The sound of sirens in the distance caught both their attention. Kane's expression shifted, a mix of annoyance and calculation. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and venomous. Emily released him, stepping back as the sirens grew louder. "You're right. It's just beginning." As Kane climbed back into the SUV, his men scrambling to follow, Emily stood her ground. The vehicle sped off into the night, its tail lights disappearing around the corner. She exhaled slowly, her heart pounding as the adrenaline began to fade. The police cars arrived moments later, their flashing lights illuminating the scene. Emily flagged them down, quickly explaining the situation while withholding the details of her own involvement. Once the officers secured the area, Emily slipped away into the shadows. She had sent a message tonight not just to Kane, but to anyone who thought they could operate above the law. But she knew this wasn't the end. Kane would be back, and he'd bring more than just idle threats next time. As she walked into the cool night air, her resolve hardened. This was the life she had chosen, to stand between the innocent and the corrupt, no matter the cost. And Marcus Kane? He was just another name on a growing list of enemies who underestimated her. Emily's lips curled into a faint, determined smile. Let them come. Emily didn't go home that night. She knew better than to assume that Marcus Kane would let things rest, even for a few hours. Men like him didn't just lick their wounds and hide. They regrouped, recalculated, and struck back harder. She had learned this the hard way during her time in the Special Forces, where every hesitation could mean death. Her steps led her to a nondescript building on the edge of town, a place she had prepared for moments exactly like this. From the outside, it looked like an abandoned mechanic's garage, its faded sign barely legible in the dim light. But inside, it was a fortress. Emily unlocked the heavy steel door and stepped into the space she called the safe. The room was dimly lit, its walls lined with shelves holding various equipment, firearms, tactical gear, surveillance tools, and neatly organized files. A single table sat in the center, cluttered with blueprints, maps, and a sleek laptop. She dropped her bag onto the table, her mind already racing through possibilities. Kane's appearance wasn't random. He had been watching her. And if he was as connected as his reputation suggested, he would have resources. She couldn't afford to let her guard down, not even for a moment. Emily powered on the laptop and quickly pulled up her encrypted files. She had spent years building a database on criminals like Kane, using her skills to quietly gather information and dismantle operations from the shadows. Her time in the Special Forces had taught her the importance of staying ahead of the enemy, and she had turned that lesson into a way of life. Marcus Kane's profile appeared on the screen, a series of photos, financial records, and connections meticulously pieced together over months of quiet investigation. Black market arms deals, human trafficking, corporate extortion, she murmured to herself, scrolling through the list of his known activities. "You've been busy." Her eyes landed on a name that had come up repeatedly in her notes, Victor Langston, a corrupt tech mogul who had been suspected of funneling money into Kane's operations. Langston's name had been plastered all over the news a few months ago when accusations of fraud surfaced, but the investigation had mysteriously disappeared. Emily frowned, leaning back in her chair. If Langston was bankrolling Kane, then taking him down could sever one of Kane's most important lifelines. But getting to Langston wouldn't be easy. He was notoriously paranoid, surrounded by private security, and operated from a heavily guarded estate on the outskirts of the city. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she began gathering updated intel on Langston. It didn't take long to find what she was looking for: a charity gala scheduled for the following evening at a high-end hotel downtown. Langston was listed as one of the key attendees. Emily's lips curled into a determined smile. Perfect. The next night, the hotel ballroom was a sea of glittering chandeliers, elegant gowns, and sharp tuxedos. Waiters weaved through the crowd with trays of champagne, and soft classical music played in the background. The event was a spectacle of wealth and influence, the kind of gathering where powerful people made deals behind polite smiles. But amidst the glamour, no one noticed the woman in the sleek black dress and understated makeup. Emily moved through the crowd like a ghost, her every step calculated and her eyes scanning for potential threats. She had spent the day preparing for this moment, assembling her disguise, memorizing the layout of the hotel, and hacking into the event's security system to gain access to restricted areas. Her years of training had taught her that the key to success was in the details, and tonight, she couldn't afford any mistakes. Her target stood near the bar, laughing loudly with a group of equally smug men. Victor Langston was shorter than she had expected, his round face flushed with alcohol and his expensive suit straining against his bulk. He didn't look like a criminal mastermind, but Emily knew better than to judge by appearances. As she approached, Langston's eyes flicked to her, his expression briefly shifting to one of curiosity. She offered a polite smile, holding a glass of champagne she had no intention of drinking. "Mr. Langston," she asked, her tone light and unassuming. He turned toward her, clearly pleased by the attention. "And you are?" "Emily St. James," she said smoothly, extending a hand. "I'm with Summit Enterprises. My boss has been very eager to meet you, but unfortunately, he couldn't attend tonight. He sent me instead." Langston's ego visibly inflated at the mention of a supposed business interest. "Summit Enterprises, huh? I've heard of them. What's your boss's name?" Emily smiled, tilting her head slightly. "If you have to ask, then perhaps we're not as big as I thought." "Shame, really I was hoping to discuss a potential partnership." Langston chuckled, the sound grating. "No need to be modest. Let's talk." She led him away from the crowd, toward a quieter corner of the room. As they walked, her eyes subtly scanned their surroundings, ensuring they weren't being watched too closely. "Mr. Langston," she began once they were alone, her voice lowering slightly, "my employer is very interested in your expertise. But before we proceed, he asked me to do some due diligence." "You understand, of course." Langston nodded, clearly intrigued. "Naturally. What kind of expertise are we talking about?" Emily leaned in, her expression serious. "The kind that involves moving large sums of money without attracting attention. And maybe a little hardware on the side." Langston's eyes narrowed slightly, suspicion flickering across his face. But before he could question her further, Emily reached into her clutch and produced a small USB drive. "My employer asked me to share this with you," she said, handing it to him. "It's a preview of what we're offering, a show of good faith." Langston took the drive, turning it over in his hand. "What's on it?" "Blueprints. Prototypes. Enough to prove we're serious." In reality, The USB drive was a carefully planted trap. The moment Langston plugged it into his system, it would upload a program that would allow Emily to access his encrypted files remotely. She had spent hours perfecting the code, knowing it was her best chance at uncovering the full extent of his connection to Kane. Langston pocketed the drive, his expression shifting to one of interest. "I'll take a look. But tell your boss this: if he wants to do business with me, he'd better come prepared to pay." Emily smiled, feigning amusement. "I'll be sure to pass that along." As Langston turned back toward the bar, Emily slipped away, her work for the night nearly complete. Back in the safety of her apartment, Emily sat in front of her laptop, watching as the program on Langston's computer began transmitting data. Financial records, emails, and transaction logs flooded her screen, each piece of information painting a clearer picture of his dealings with Marcus Kane. She leaned back in her chair, her mind already racing with possibilities. She now had the leverage she needed to strike at Kane's operation from multiple angles. But as she stared at the screen, one file caught her attention: a single email from Kane, dated 2 days ago. It read, "Langston, the Walker problem is escalating. She's not just a nuisance, she's a threat. Handle her, or I will." Emily's jaw tightened. Kane wasn't just reacting to her interference, he had been planning to neutralize her from the start. A small, determined smile played on her lips. If Kane thought he could outmaneuver her, he was in for a rude awakening. This wasn't just about taking him down anymore. This was personal. And Emily Walker never lost a fight. Emily didn't drive away immediately. Instead, she sat in her car, watching the quiet street in the rearview mirror. She knew from experience that people like Marcus Kane didn't take humiliation lightly. He wouldn't let this go. Those 3 bikers were likely pawns, disposable muscle sent to test her, maybe even distract her. Kane was calculating, methodical, and she had just made herself a priority on his list of problems. Reaching over to the passenger seat, Emily opened her glove box and pulled out a thin, leather-bound notebook. It was well worn, the edges of the pages frayed from years of use. This was her personal log, a collection of every case, every operation, and every enemy she'd encountered since leaving Special Forces. Flipping through the pages, she found Marcus Kane's name scrawled in bold letters. Underneath it were notes, photographs, and details she'd been compiling for months. Emily tapped her pen thoughtfully against the steering wheel. Tonight's encounter had been a warning, a reminder that Kane was still a threat. But now, he'd given her something valuable: his attention. If Kane was sending his men to deal with her, it meant he was nervous. And nervous men made mistakes. The next morning, Emily's car rolled into the parking lot of an old warehouse on the edge of town. It was the kind of place most people avoided, its exterior rusted and abandoned, with keep out signs plastered across the chain-link fence. But Emily knew better. This wasn't just an empty shell. Inside was where she'd built her operations hub, a place she could work without prying eyes. She stepped inside, and the heavy steel door clanged shut behind her. The air smelled faintly of oil and metal, and the faint hum of her equipment filled the space. The room was modest, but efficient. A row of computer monitors lit up one side, each displaying live feeds from street cameras, maps, and encrypted files. A rack of tactical gear stood in the corner, alongside a locked weapons cabinet. Emily booted up her main terminal and logged into her secure server. The screen filled with images of Kane's network, names, locations, transaction records. She had been tracking him for months, but now she had something new to add to her dossier: last night's events. She typed quickly, entering details about the 3 bikers and their failed ambush. As she worked, she paused on one of the names, Victor Langston. He was one of Kane's primary financiers, a tech mogul who used his vast resources to launder money and move weapons under the radar. Langston was cautious, rarely stepping into the spotlight. But Emily had a hunch that he was the key to dismantling Kane's operation. Her eyes narrowed as she clicked through her files. She needed to act fast. Kane wouldn't waste time. If Langston was involved, there was a chance he'd already be covering his tracks. That evening, Emily found herself parked outside Langston's mansion. The sprawling estate was surrounded by high walls and patrolled by security guards, their flashlights cutting through the dark like searchlights. Cameras dotted the perimeter, and the faint glow of infrared sensors hinted at the high-tech defenses Langston had installed. But Emily wasn't intimidated. She had faced worse. Dressed in dark tactical gear, Emily moved swiftly, scaling the wall with ease. She landed silently on the other side, her movements precise and controlled. She paused for a moment, her sharp eyes scanning the grounds. The guards were predictable, their patrol routes repetitive. Emily waited until the nearest guard turned his back, then slipped through the shadows toward the main house. Inside, the mansion was a testament to excess. Polished marble floors, ornate chandeliers, and priceless artwork filled every room. But Emily had no time to admire the decor. She moved quickly, her footsteps silent against the marble. She knew exactly where she was going. Langston's office was on the second floor, a secure space protected by a biometric lock. Emily reached into her pocket and pulled out a small device, a signal interceptor she'd designed herself. Holding it up to the scanner, she watched as it mimicked Langston's fingerprint, unlocking the door with a faint click. The office was cluttered with papers, folders, and computer monitors. Emily moved to the desk and began sifting through the files. Most of it was mundane financial reports, contracts, invoices. But then, tucked beneath a stack of documents, she found something interesting, a ledger. Her eyes scanned the entries, each one detailing payments made to Marcus Kane. Weapons shipments, bribes, offshore accounts, it was all there, carefully documented. Emily pulled out her phone and began snapping photos of each page. This was the evidence she needed to bring Langston and Kane down. But just as she finished, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. Emily froze, her body tense. She could hear muffled voices, 2 guards, maybe 3. They were getting closer. The door burst open, and the guards stormed in, their weapons drawn. For a split second, they looked at the empty office, confused. Then, out of nowhere, Emily struck. She dropped down from the ceiling, where she had wedged herself between the beams. Her movements were swift and precise. Before the guards could react, she disarmed the first, flipping him over her shoulder and slamming him into the ground. The second guard lunged at her, but Emily sidestepped his attack, delivering a sharp kick to his chest that sent him sprawling. The third guard hesitated, his weapon shaking in his hands. Emily met his gaze, her expression calm but cold. "Don't," she said simply. The guard dropped his weapon and bolted from the room. Emily wasted no time. She grabbed the ledger, slipped it into her bag, and made her escape. By the time reinforcements arrived, she was already gone, melting into the night like a shadow. Back at her safe house, Emily spread the ledger across the table, her mind racing. This was the breakthrough she needed. The evidence in Langston's files was enough to implicate not only him, but Marcus Kane and several of their associates. But she couldn't stop here. She needed to deliver this information to the right people who wouldn't be bought or intimidated. Emily picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. "Agent Ramirez," a familiar voice answered. "It's Emily Walker," she said, her voice steady. "I have something you'll want to see." The next few days were a blur of activity. Emily worked tirelessly, coordinating with Ramirez and his team to ensure the evidence was secure. She provided detailed accounts of Kane's operations, using her years of surveillance and research to paint a complete picture of his criminal empire. Then, the arrests began. It started with Langston, who was dragged out of his mansion in handcuffs, his face pale and stunned. His arrest made headlines, and it wasn't long before the authorities began closing in on Kane. One by one, his associates were rounded up, their operations dismantled. Finally, Kane himself was cornered in a remote hideout. He tried to resist, but it was futile. The last image Emily saw of him was on the news, a man once untouchable, now reduced to a broken figure in handcuffs. For the first time in months, Emily allowed herself to breathe. She sat on the roof of her safe house, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. She had done it. Kane's empire was gone, his influence shattered. And while she knew there would always be more criminals like him, tonight, she felt a sense of peace. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. It was Ramirez. "They're all in custody," he said. "You did good, Walker." Emily smiled faintly. "We did good." As she ended the call, she leaned back, the cool night air brushing against her skin. She didn't need recognition or thanks. Knowing the city was a little safer was enough. Sometimes, justice wasn't about medals or headlines. It was about doing the right thing, even when no one was watching. And for Emily Walker, that was more than enough. The soft hum of Emily's car echoed through the night, the low rumble of the engine almost soothing as she drove through the empty streets. The city, now a little safer thanks to her efforts, sprawled out around her. The bright lights of the skyscrapers reflected off the wet asphalt, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch with every turn. It was quiet. Too quiet, maybe, but in a way that felt right. She wasn't looking for attention, nor was she interested in the noise of victory. As Emily steered the car through the empty roads, her mind wandered back to the events of the past few days. The bikers. Marcus Kane's criminal empire. The hidden hours of planning, the quiet observations she had made over the months. So much had been done without anyone ever realizing. She hadn't shouted about her plans, nor had she drawn attention to herself. Her power had been her silence, the ability to see, understand, and act without drawing attention to the steps she was taking. The world often assumed that power came in loud forms. Those who shouted the loudest were seen as the strongest, the most confident. Muscles, bravado, threats. People were drawn to the outward signs of power, thinking they were the only real markers of strength. But Emily had learned long ago that strength was not about how loudly you roared, or how many muscles you showed, or how big your threats were. True strength was quieter than that. It was hidden beneath layers of calm, beneath an unshakable confidence that didn't need to make a scene. Emily had carried that kind of strength for years. When she was in the special forces, she had learned to master her emotions, to stay focused no matter the chaos around her. And even now, as she drove away from the aftermath of her actions, her mind remained steady. She wasn't the kind of person to gloat or celebrate loudly. No. Her satisfaction came from knowing that justice had been served, and the city was a little safer. The criminals would be behind bars, and the streets would quiet down once again. The real reward was knowing she had done what needed to be done without needing to tell anyone, without needing to be recognized for it. That was the thing about Emily Walker: she didn't need the spotlight. She didn't need anyone to clap her on the back or throw a parade in her honor. What mattered to her was the result. The safety of those who would never even know her name, the quiet peace that followed a job well done. The people who would continue their lives, oblivious to the danger that had once loomed over them, would never realize that Emily had been the one to shield them from it. And that was okay. In fact, it was better that way. Sometimes, the best kind of protection was the one that wasn't even seen. As she drove, she thought about the lesson that had been taught that night. Not just to those bikers who had foolishly tried to rob her, but to anyone who had ever underestimated the quiet ones. People like them, people who relied on force and fear to get what they wanted, had always underestimated Emily. They thought she was just another woman, another victim waiting to happen. But she wasn't. She never had been. Emily had the quiet confidence that only came from understanding who she was and what she was capable of. It didn't matter how big or strong the opponent was. It didn't matter how loud they shouted. What mattered was how you stood when the moment came. She thought about all the other times in her life, the times when she'd faced challenges that seemed insurmountable. There had been moments when others doubted her, moments when people had written her off. But each time, she had stayed calm. Each time, she had kept her focus. Because in those moments, she knew something others didn't: silence could be stronger than a shout. Quiet could be more powerful than force. As the road ahead began to blur with the light of distant stars, Emily allowed herself a small, private smile. It wasn't one of pride. It wasn't one of joy. It was a smile of understanding. Of knowing that, for all the noise and chaos in the world, there was always a quiet strength that could rise above it. She had seen it in herself for years. And now, the world had seen it, too. A light rain began to fall, tapping softly against the windshield. It was the kind of rain that came gently, without warning, soothing in its own way. Emily didn't mind it. In fact, she liked it. The world felt peaceful when it rained like this. It was as though the earth itself was taking a moment to breathe, to reset, to prepare for what came next. And for Emily, there was always something next. There would always be another challenge, another enemy, another fight to be had. But she didn't fear it. She didn't worry about it. She simply faced it, knowing that the same quiet strength that had gotten her through this battle would carry her through the next. The rain was now a steady patter against the car, a rhythmic sound that matched the steady beat of her heart. Emily didn't hurry, she didn't rush. She took her time, allowing the night to unfold as it would. Her thoughts turned inward, reflecting on the lesson that had just been taught. That sometimes the most dangerous thing to underestimate wasn't the loudest threat, but the quietest force. People didn't always understand it, didn't always see it for what it was. But they would eventually. As she neared the edge of the city, the lights behind her began to fade, leaving only the dark, open road ahead. And with that road came a sense of freedom that only came when you knew you had done what was right, no matter the cost, no matter the consequences. Emily didn't need anyone to thank her. She didn't need the recognition. What mattered was that justice had been served, and she had done it her way, quietly, calmly, without a single word wasted. She had shown the world that strength didn't need to shout. It didn't need to scream. It just needed to be. And for Emily Walker, that was enough. The world had learned something valuable that night. It had learned that silence could be just as powerful as a roar, and that true strength didn't need to prove itself to anyone. Sometimes, the quiet ones were the most dangerous. And in that moment, Emily was at peace knowing that she was the kind of danger no one could see coming.